Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming. And welcome to the Wills Memorial Building, and welcome to everybody watching live. This event is being hosted by the Bristol Free Speech Society here at the University of Bristol. Tonight, we are privileged to be joined by Tasnime Akunjee for a conversation that remains at the forefront of the national discourse and has important implications for us all. Tasnime is a criminal defence solicitor who has worked in the field of terrorism for over 2 decades. He rose to national prominence when he represented the families of 3 15-year-old girls who left their secondary school in Bethnell Green for Raqqa in 2015. The most famous of these individuals being, of course, Shamima Begum, who, despite being born, raised, and radicalised in the UK, has had her British citizenship revoked by the then Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, and that was in 2019. Tasnime has been is a strong critic of Prevent, sparking controversy when he suggested that Muslims shouldn't cooperate with the programme. He also recently led a successful libel case against the EDL founder, Tommy Robinson, for making false claims about a video depicting a 15-year-old Syrian refugee suffering a racist attack at his school. Robinson was ordered by a judge to pay £100,000 to the victim and has since filed for bankruptcy. Tonight's event is entitled Civil Liberties, Prevent and Defending Shamima Begum. Tasnime will speak on these issues for around 40 minutes, after which he will take questions from the audience. Viewers on Zoom can ask questions through the Slido link, which will hopefully be posted in the chat, and is BFSS 2021, and that's just on slido.com. And the in-person audience here can raise your hands and ask a question, and I'll prompt you, and that'll be after Tasnime's spoken. So with all that said and done, it's my pleasure to hand over to Tasnime.
Well, thank you. Now that you reminded me, I've been working for 20 years. I'll put my early order for a Zoom paper. So I'll move in. I know this lecture has been billed as covering all aspects of civil liberties, prevent Shamima Begum. These are 3 massive subjects, which would take lectures in and of themselves going into the hours. So what I propose to do today is to look at those 3 subjects through the narrow frame of the evolution of the terrorism laws and how they in particular whittled down our civil liberties over the last 20 years. Many of you weren't alive, maybe, at the time when 9/11 happened. And many of us think that 9/11 is that watershed moment where the terrorism laws have kicked in and civil liberties were affected. The truth is that our Terrorism Act 2000 hit the books a year before September 11th. It was actually being debated and discussed back in the late 1990s. But the Terrorism Act 2000 was the first of a number of general terrorism acts passed by our Parliament. It superseded and repealed the previous acts of the Prevention of Terrorism, temporary provisions of 89, and also the Emergency Provision Act 96. It also repealed the Criminal Justice Terrorism and Conspiracy Act 1998. And you'll see by the feature of these acts that they were temporary. Previously, terrorism as a concept had always been a difficult thing for civil courts, for civil society to deal with. And the reason is because we generally have 2 types of law. We have the law of war, where it is accepted that harm and damage and death will occur legally. And then we have the civilian jurisdiction, where we have our police. Terrorism is one of these strange situations where you have the activities of war happening on civil soil. And so you have this hybrid of laws that are then forced to deal with this exceptional situation. But the powers that came with the Terrorism Act 2000 were markedly different to what were there before. And the powers have proved controversial. The Terrorism Act itself, or the definition of terrorism, was debated at length in Parliament, and Lord Boyd was tasked with the unenviable task of trying to define it. And this is what he said about the matter. We must obviously do our best with the definition, and having spent many hours looking at many different definitions, of which there are over 100, I can only conclude that there are a great difficulties in finding a satisfactory definition. Indeed, I was unable to do so, and I suspect rather arrogantly that no one else will succeed. However, succeed they did. But let's look at what existed before. So prior to 9/11, under the 1989 Act, we had a very pragmatic approach to terrorism. And it was defined as the use of violence for political ends and includes any use of violence for the purpose of putting the public or a section of the public in fear. So important points. were that the jury would decide, was there violence, actual violence for political ends, and was a section of the public actually put in fear? Very simple, very pragmatic, and very much for a jury to decide. Fast forwarding on to 2000, and we have a much more complex situation. It's important to look at the detail. Terrorism here is defined as the use or threat of action, not just violence, designed to influence the government or an international governmental organisation, or to intimidate the public or a section of the public made for the purpose of advancing political, and importantly religious, racial or ideological causes. It also included serious violence against a person and damage to property, which is a new concept. A threat to a person's life, unsurprising, but a serious risk to health and safety of the public, and in the modern age, a serious interference with disruption to an orthodox system. It introduced religion, race, and ideology into the idea of what terrorism is, and can be, action instead of violence, which covers almost any sort of behaviour. Action against property and electronic systems were now terrorism. And this is property or electronic systems anywhere, not just in the UK. The government is any government, not just the UK government, and the public is any public, not just the UK government. It massively widens the scope of behaviour that could potentially fall foul of criminality. What did our security services, or those who led our security services, think about this legislation way back then? And we have our security services here at MI5, the domestic threat they look at, and MI6, which is the foreign threat they operate off UK Syria. And the head of MI5, up until 96, just before this law was brought in, was Stella Remington, This is what she had to say about it. It would be better that the government recognise that there are risks rather than frightening people in order to be able to pass laws which restrict civil liberties, which is precisely one of the objects of terrorism, that we live in fear and under a police state. I think people are fully aware that the more you intrude into people's civil liberties, the more you set up grievances for people to do all the unpleasant things that are going on. In short, her view was that terror laws fulfill the ends of terrorists in and of themselves and actually encourage terrorism in the long run. So Richard Dearlove was the head of MI6 up until 2004 from 1999, and his view was that the problem with Islamist extremism today has only marginally affected the West. The government and media have exaggerated the threat of Islamic fundamentalism by vilifying misguided young men rather pathetic figures. Surely it's better to ignore them. And Professor Clive Walker, who frankly wrote the book on terrorism at the University of Leeds, the opinion is that Terrorism Act 2000 represents a worthwhile attempt to fulfil the role of the modern code against terrorism, although it fails to meet the desired standards in all respects. There are aspects where rights are probably breached, and its mechanism to ensure democratic accountability and constitutionalism are even more deficient. So, regardless of these warnings from security services, regardless of our academic concerns, the march of law or terrorism legislation moved on. Some say evolution, some say devolution. And this is just a raft of the legislation that came about. Involvements of Terrorism Act 2000, REPA powers, which are, again in 2000, these are powers that are conferred to the police to access information. The Prevention of Terrorism Act 2005 created control orders. And these are orders where the Home Secretary can deign that through secret evidence that you are involved in terrorist-related activity, not terrorism, terrorism-related activity, and it doesn't meet the standard or evidential standard to actually prosecute you for any crime. But despite this, they can keep you under house arrest, and the evidence will be held in secret, or made by secret. Your lawyers won't see the evidence, special advocates are set up. And so it was an entirely new and strange type of system that was created to deal with people who hadn't quite committed crimes yet. Terrorism Act 2006 and 2008, yeah, it carries on. And the last one we recently, the Counter-Terrorism Sentencing Act 2021, we'll come on to some of the main provisions in a moment. We'll go into the development of the terrorism laws with the 2000 Act. Specific parts were creating new offences of inciting terrorism abroad. So in the past, the UK accepted that its jurisdiction was within its borders. Now, activity that you do in the UK that could be for political reasons about a government abroad could be seen as inciting terrorism. That it gave the police stop the search powers without suspicion. So normally, if you are going about your business, the police would have to have a bit of information about you, likely to mean that you were committing a crime before they could stop you. It couldn't be based upon racial characteristics. So, oh, look, there's a black guy over there, let's stop it, completely illegal. But Section 44 and Schedule 7 allow the police to stop anybody if it's in a designated area without any suspicion at all. We'll see the abuses that flowed from that a bit later. There was a detention for 7 days, and the Home Secretary was given the power to prescribe an organisation. So a politician was allowed to point at an organisation and say, no, from now on, this organisation is a terrorist organisation. Anyone who is affiliated to that is committing a criminal offence, and anyone who even supports it or says they support it is committing a criminal offence. And finally, 57 and 58 of the Act, which makes material likely to be used to terrorists in your possession, either with intention or recklessly, a criminal act. So we will see, if you research this, you will see that a particular book called the Anarchist Cookbook, which is widely available online for free, not to say to get it, you can download it, not saying to do so, you can download it from the Federal Court website. You can also buy a copy from Waterstones, if you like. It's about £17.50, and you can get it on Amazon for roughly the price as well. But if you have it, you can also be arrested, charged, and convicted, even if you had no intent to do anything but read of a criminal offence. So it's quite a ridiculous scenario where you can buy the book in a shop and it's for sale, but to possess it, please don't have a look at it, then you will get a sentence. The British government recently put up sentences to start with discussing. The Anti-Terrorism and Crime Security Act 2001 gave the Home Secretary the power to indefinitely detain, without charge or trial, foreign nationals. This was eventually struck down as illegal. However, the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2005 came to the rescue of the Home Secretary and then allowed not just the power to indefinitely detain, that charge or trial, foreign nationals, but everyone, really, as long as they could show that you were involved in terrorist-related activity, whatever that may mean. The Terrorism Act 2006 introduced into a biblical language into the idea of terrorism, which was the glorification of terrorism. So if one was sad, I would say, I guess, I really like Osama bin Laden, well, that would be a criminal offence. And the 2015 Act put prevent on a statutory footing. The Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, which became the Act, has recently created an offence of remaining in an area outside the United Kingdom that has been designated by the Secretary of State, an area where you are not allowed to go. So effectively, geography, the Secretary of State can now point to a geography. In this case, it's in Syria, and say if any British national is there without reasonable excuse, is yet to be tested, then if they remain there whilst the orders were put in place, or if they go there after the orders were put in place, then they're now committing a terrorist-related offence. So given the very wide definition of the laws that have now been granted to our police forces, let's examine some of the abuses that occur. And particularly Section 44, or Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, these are really where a lot of the abuses come from. And these are the stop and search provisions. So Section 44 allowed the police to stop and search anyone in a designated area without having to show any reasonable suspicion. Now, the police, the Metropolitan Police, designated the whole of London a designated area for a period of about 10 years, and so effectively allowed themselves the powers to stop anyone without any cause or any reason at all. And unsurprisingly, 1 year alone, it was used to stop only 150,000 people alone. Black and Asian people were between 5 and 7 times more likely to be stopped under the provision, and figures released by the Home Office on the 5th of March in 2007 showed that 1,126 people were arrested, 221 were charged with terrorism offences, and 40 were subsequently convicted of a terrorism offence. When I originally put this element of lecture together, no one had actually been charged by that stage of the terrorism offence. However, the European Court of Human Rights in 2010 struck down this law as being failing to provide any sort of safeguards against abuse, and abuse was clearly being shown. However, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act is almost exactly the same as Section 44. However, it's limited to only airports and ports, international ports of egress and entry and egress. So a passenger at the port without any reasonable suspicion can be held for questioning for up to 6 hours, and those detained must give an officer any information that they request. So in the normal course of business, if you're stopped by the police, you have a right to silence. You say no comment, you don't have to say anything at all, in fairness, and it can't be held against you, subject to certain issues moving forward. But in a port, if you're stopped on the Schedule 7 with no reason at all, if you fail to answer a question, then you're committing a criminal offence by not answering. That offence can lead you to a conviction of 3 months in prison and or a fine of up to £6,000. That also includes not giving your PIN numbers or your passwords to your electronic devices. Your electronic devices can also be copied. Any non-intimate samples can be taken from you, fingerprints, photograph, DNA, and also the officers, and not just police, that's immigration officers as well, have the ability to search any vehicle you happen to be travelling as well at the time. A funny scenario that occurs is if you fail to answer those questions when they're asked of you, you'll be arrested, taken to the police station, at which point you'll perfectly within the rights of not answering questions then. So, but you will still be convicted. Pattern analysis of the deployment of Schedule 7 showed that a total of 53,000 and 54,000 people were stopped between 2012 and 2013, and suggests that stereotyping rather than intelligence was actually a key factor around why people were stopped. A specific example of the abuse is the David Miranda case, which was quite famous at the time. David Miranda was a partner of Greenwald, who was a journalist who blew the lid on the global surveillance program operated by the National Security Agency of the United States. He was detained at Heathrow Airport for 9 hours at the time, Schedule 7. And of his case, David Kennedy, who was his barrister, said, if someone travelling as part of journalistic work can be lawfully detained like this, questioned for hours without a lawyer present, his electronic equipment confiscated and cloned, all without the merest suspicion of anyone doing required, then clearly something has gone wrong with the law. It's important that we use this case to shed light on the murky, everyday reality of Schedule 7, that Paris consistently used to target minorities who are 42 times more likely to be stopped if you're Asian than if you're white. And goes on to say that the core message is clear: Schedule 7 may be lawful, but it is rotten law. Other examples of abuse were back in 2008, where the Icelandic bank, Banksy, was going through some liquidity issues. Our government side company, Gordon Brown, decided to designate the Icelandic bank as a terrorist organisation on par with Al Qaeda, so that they could avoid the effects of non-liquidity to the UK depositors, of which the court service had actually deposited quite a lot of its funds in the Icelandic bank, because they had ridiculously high interest rates, which were clearly a scam at the time. The order was made under the Anti-Terrorism, Prying and Security Act, and that, as I said, Banksy was held briefly as a designated as a terrorist organisation. Walter Wolfgang, again, he was a refugee from Nazi Germany and a Labour Party member from 1928. He died some time ago at the age of 92. But I suspect that he probably would have left the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. At a conference with the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw in 2005, Jack Straw stated, "We are in Iraq for one reason only, to help the elected Iraqi government build a secure, democratic, stable nation," for which Mr. Wolfgang shouted out, "That's a lie." He was manhandled by stewards and ejected, which is within the rights of the stewards. However, he was then detained by police under Section 44 of the Terrorism Act for a period of time. Again, as I say, no suspicion required to detain him. REPA powers, which we touched on briefly, these were the powers that allow officers to request data from phone companies without a judge's approval. Well, Cleveland police was believed to have used the powers to search for a source that they were interested in that a journalist had tried to protect. And they were the 5th UK police force believed to have obtained those powers and that information under the Raqqa legislation. That legislation itself had been used by councils previously to spy on residents because their dogs were pooing in the park, and to give them fines, and also on parents who they suspected of lying about their address to get their kids into schools that was seen as better. That very obvious abuse of those powers was subsequently tightened up so that it couldn't be used for some ridiculous purpose. That is the general arc of the last 20 years of the actual criminal space, things that you can do or fail to do that will get you arrested and convicted as a terrorist. However, not happy with that, our government wants to move into the pre-criminal space, much like Tom Cruise in the Minority Report. So that's the reason he's there. But the pre-criminal space we're going to focus on is the government policy on tackling extremism, which comes under the idea of what they call contest. But contest has 4 different parts: prevent, pursue, protect, and prepare. The other 3 parts are to do with bolstering our current police force, security services, and general rigour against terrorism. Actual, but prevent is the part of the policy which is designed ostensibly to safeguard people and communities against extremism, and it's there to try and dissuade people, so it says on the tin, from engaging in extremist activity. It's a nationwide policy. Again, it's one of the 4 arms of contest. Under the prevent policies, public servants, including doctors, teachers, librarians, and nurses, are encouraged to actively seek signs of radicalisation in their dependents and clientele. If they see any number of signs, of which there are many, they are obliged to refer the person sent to the programme, where they will be assessed as a threat to society and potentially indelibly marked. Now, the stated purpose of prevent is to respond to the ideological challenge that we face from terrorism and aspects of extremism and the threat we face from those who promote those views. It's there to provide, in theory, practical hope for people who've been drawn into these sort of ways of thinking, and it's supposed to work with a wide range of sectors: education, criminal justice, faith, schools, judges as well. In 2015, the Terrorism and Security Act made this a statutory requirement for any government organisation, including schools and doctors, NHS doctors, that they had to turn their minds to these issues. So previously, it was just a policy that government could, it was your opinion as to whether you engage with it or not, but now it's a statutory requirement. And what that has led to is forcing people who are police officers, teachers, nursery school teachers, psychiatrists, to then try and identify anyone who falls within extremism, given a definition that's provided by itself. Here's the definition: vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, rule of law, individual liberties, and mutual respect and tolerance for different faiths and beliefs. Given what we've seen recently in Parliament, half of those people in Parliament ought to be referred anyway, but we digress. What this means in reality is that teachers, doctors, lecturers are expected to monitor the behaviour of the people on their care, if they're suspected to be extreme, and pass their names up to what's known as a channel program. The concerns about prevent are pretty manifold. Its origins are opaque because it's securitized. We don't know exactly how much money is devoted to it. It tends to operate through giving lots of money to councils, who then pass them on to different schemes. And they also, within the police force and security services, they have access to lots of money, but that's all securitized. We don't know how much goes where or what they do with it, and therefore we don't know the metrics. But its origins can be traced to a clandestine German criminology that set out a radicalisation prediction model comprising of 22 factors. This was the ERG 22. This model, the theoretical model, was tested on a very small sample of adult male American prisoners, and its conclusion was that the model could not be used as a predictive tool. It could not be used to predict people's behaviour. Yet, even though that is the model, and that is the warning that comes with the model, that is the tool being used by Prevent to this day. There have been a number of studies as to why individuals are radicalised and choose to commit acts of terror during groups that are responsible for terrorism. And experts are unanimous in that there is no single driver for radicalisation, rather it's rather multifaceted and complex process, differs person to person and geography to geography. Even MI5's own behavioural scientific analysis of several hundred terrorists showed that they have strikingly different journeys to violent extremist activity. Notably few have followed atypical of extremism. The number of other studies, this slide will be available to anyone who's interested, but a number of studies I've posted here that are saying exactly the same thing. There is no such thing as a conveyor belt to extremism or terrorism. It is always a different path. And what these papers show is not only do our security services know it, our government knows it, and they know who measures it. Our government's own analysis of their extremism strategy shows that 1 in 5 people refer to Channel's de-radicalisation programme required supporting intervention, which meant that 80% of the people referred to Channel were done for malicious or inappropriate reasons, and only 5% of those who were referred actually were given any sort of help. And that means that 95% of those referred were never appropriately referred in the first place. So we can look at some examples of the questionable application of Prevent. So we had a 3-year-old who was referred to the Prevent de-radicalisation programme. Presumably he was taught to speak first before he could be de-radicalised. The 4-year-old, for mispronouncing cucumber, he said cuckable. There's a picture of his drawing afterwards. It may be that cast light as to why he was reported. A 10-year-old misspelled terrorist house, and terrorist house, so dyslexia also causing you to be referred. And a 14-year-old was referred for using the phrase eco-terrorist in a discussion about rainforests and ecology. So you can see that in these scenarios, because discretion is given to people without training, and sometimes maybe even maliciously, people are referred. And this affects people's lives. That is the misapplication of Prevent, comical misapplications of Prevent. But here's a list of situations where people were referred to Prevent and what happened. So we have very recently the murder of Sir David Abase. This is only a matter of weeks old by Ali Harvey. He was on the Prevent program. The program was meant to dissuade people to away from terrorism and to leave extremism. He was not on there for long, and he came out of that program and then committed a horrific politically motivated murder. At the moment, he's not been convicted, so allegedly. In 2020, we have the Reading stabbings. Kira Shah he attacked people who were in a park with a knife. 3 men died from the wounds, and others were seriously injured. He was also on the Prevent program and assessed as not being somebody of interest. The London Bridge stabbing was on Khan. He was actually in custody, having served time for an actual terrorist offence. Released from prison in 2018 under license, he was part of a de-radicalisation scheme in prison. David Wilkinson was professor of criminology at Birmingham University, stated there was a so-called de-radicalisation program. If you went through that program, then it's on another level. That program clearly did not de-radicalise. Again, harking back to the fundamental flaw, the idea that you can actually deprogram people or deprogram. But the Parsons has been trained by even more ridiculous a scenario. You have a child who's come over as a child refugee. He had admitted in an interview, an immigration interview, that he had contact with the Islamic State. He'd been trained how to kill, and that he was left to his own devices, really having been put on the program. And as a young man with less than 5, had a chemistry degree, managed to put being all these in a posh manner, classic explosive scale, and attempted to detonate the train. Thank goodness that did not go off as efficiently as he planned it. The London Bridge attack, this was a rather famous one in 2017. Van deliberately driven into pedestrians, 3 occupants ran out, 8 people were killed, they were wearing pretend suicide vests, 48 people were injured, and the New York Times reports that bus, the bus, and his brother as well, were part of the UK Prevent programme. We can go on with that. Ariana Grande bombing, Salman Abedi, he was not on the Prevent programme, and that is really quite surprising, given that friends and families of his had reported him for extremism to the authorities repeatedly. Yet, despite this, he was banned from his local mosque and known as extremist, and yet the Prevent programme did not capture him as someone who was interested, leading to 23 people's deaths and thousands. Senior police officer Dal Babu, who was ex-chief superintendent of the Metropolitan Police, he said at Prevent, most Muslims are suspicious of the scheme series to spying on them. There was a spectacular lack of diversity in local safeguarding services and police forces, that many of those involved in Prevent did not understand the communities they serve. Prevent has become a toxic brand and is widely mistrusted. And again, MI5 and MI5, and also the Independent Review of Terrorism Legislation, Baroness Elizabeth Manning Butler, who's now the Director of Chatham House, and David Anderson, who was the Independent Review of Terrorism Legislation. However, does not cover Prevent, said this of it. Baroness Butler says, it seems to me that Prevent is clearly not working. It also follows, therefore, I'm not convinced of the value of putting Prevent on statutory footing. These are comments of 2015. The government may be able to convince me, but I cannot see how legislation can really govern hearts and minds and free speech. And of Baron Anderson, the lack of competence aspects of the Prevent programme, particularly but not exclusively amongst Muslims, is undeniable. The Prevent strategy as a whole should be subject to review. The special rapporteur for the previous assembly, Mr. Manu Kiaki, is a Kenyan lawyer, and on his official visit to the UK, said this of Prevent. By dividing, stigmatising, and alienating segments of the population, Prevent could end up promoting extremism rather than countering. Our good friends, Mr. Sir Eric Pickle and Philip Davis, decided to comment on his comment. You can guess what they said. Sir Eric Pickle says, sometimes when you say something stupid while visiting another country, it's better to stay quiet. Advice for Prince Philip when he was around. Tory MP Philip Davies, a member of the Common Justice Select Committee, this lecture on human rights by somebody from Africa is staggering. He should clear off back to his own continent to look at some of the grotesque abuses of human rights that take place on a daily basis, led by people like Robert Mugabe. So I'm only finding statements at best. And then we go to Shamima Begum. How is that going? Well, Shamima Begum was a cohort had a girl of 4 girls who went off from one school called the Bethnell Green to join ISIS. 1 girl left in December 2014, and 3 girls then also left in February 2015. It's the worst case of child radicalisation in the Western Hemisphere. And the headmaster Mark Keary confirmed in a parliamentary select committee that he had applied the Prevent criteria to all his students, and none of the girls, there were 4 others who were of concern as well afterwards, none of the girls featured on any but one factor on the Prevent criteria. And that factor was simply that they, at the age of 15, started wearing hijabs, which is pretty common for girls from that background at that sort of age. 3 of the 4 girls who went to Syria are reported dead. 2 of them were confirmed. 1 has yet contact family. The only person surviving out of that scenario is Shamima Begum. She herself had 3 children, 2 of which died before she tried to come back to the UK. She struck out from ISIS controlled territory on her own, heavily pregnant with the 3rd child, made it to a refugee camp run by the Kurds, and subsequently gave birth to a young boy. The camp itself is so poorly run that the child mortality rates are pretty concerning. Unsurprisingly, her newborn baby died within 2 weeks. But Sajid at the time decided that the appropriate thing to do with a young woman who's trying to come back to the UK is to strip her of her citizenship based on Section 40 of the British Nationality Act, which allows for Home Secretary Proud to do so, as long as he deems that the person who stripping is not conducive to the public good, and also by stripping them of their citizenship, he's not legally stateless. Bangladesh, however, confirmed that they don't counter as a system, because she's never been proven. And that decision is now being appealed. If it continues, and the next hearing will be in November 2022. With that, I'll